This 82-year-old grandmother was completely taken for granted by her ungrateful family. They called her old-fashioned, ignored her, and secretly planned to put her in a home so they could liquidate her late husband's assets. But they never imagined this quiet matriarch was about to expose a secret that had been buried for 40 years. What they didn't know was that she had the one thing that could prove their perfect grandson was never the family's rightful heir. The dining room table was set for a perfect family. The sterling silver, my wedding silver, gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier. The china, a pattern Robert and I had chosen over 60 years ago, was laid out with a precision that would have made my own mother proud. From the head of the table I watched them, my son Richard looking tired and avoiding my gaze as he always did these days. His wife Susan, whose smile was a little too bright, a little too fixed as she passed the porcelain gravy boat. And my grandson Mark, the center of their universe, tapping away on his phone even as he sat at my table. On the surface, it was a picture of Sunday dinner perfection. But I've learned over 82 years that surfaces are often the most deceptive part of all. Mark eventually put his phone down, but only to hold court. He spoke in a language of acronyms and buzzwords that felt entirely foreign in this house of oak and memories. He was explaining his new tech startup, something about leveraging synergistic platforms to disrupt the legacy space. I listened, nodding in what I hoped were the right places. He would occasionally turn to me and simplify his voice loud and slow as if I were a child. He told me they were building a new kind of digital ecosystem, and it was going to be a unicorn. I smiled, thinking of the little glass unicorn I kept on my windowsill, and knew we were not talking about the same thing. My son and daughter-in-law would hang on his every word, their faces glowing with a pride that seemed to eclipse everything else in the room. They would look from his animated face to my quiet one, their expressions silently urging me to be more impressed, to join in the worship of the new world he was building. The meal wore on a slow parade of perfectly cooked roast beef and polite, empty chatter. I decided to venture onto what I thought was safe ground. I asked a simple question about the manufacturing business my Robert had built from nothing, the company that had paid for this house, for Richard's education, and for the seed money Mark had used for his own ventures. I simply wondered if they still had the contract with the union local Robert had been so proud of. Richard flinched, and Susan immediately jumped in to talk about the lovely weather. But Mark just scoffed, putting his fork down with a clatter. He told me straight out that nobody does things that way anymore. He said unions, pensions, and handshake deals were quaint, but ultimately inefficient. They were, in his exact words, old-fashioned. The words hung in the air, heavier than the scent of roast beef. Old-fashioned. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, as if it were a disease, something to be ashamed of. As if the foundation he was standing on was nothing more than rubble to be cleared away. I saw the look that passed between Richard and Susan, not of defense, for me, or for Robert's legacy, but of annoyance that I had disrupted the evening's perfect facade. Trying to smooth things over, I mentioned quietly that I understood things change. I told them I'd been spending my afternoons in Robert's old office organizing his papers. I said it was nice to feel close to him by touching the things he'd touched. Susan patted my hand and said that was a lovely hobby for me to have, that it was important to keep busy. The dismissal was so gentle, so kind, that it was sharper than any insult. They saw a lonely old woman playing with scraps of paper, a relic living in her own museum. They had no idea I was actually an archaeologist, carefully digging through the layers of our family's history, unearthing the bones they thought were long buried. I felt a sudden weariness, a deep chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the old windows. I folded my napkin, placed it on the table, and excused myself, murmuring something about needing to take my medication. I walked out of the dining room and paused in the dim light of the hallway, my hand resting on the back of a familiar armchair. their voices now hushed to a conspiratorial whisper, carried clearly from the room I'd just left. It was Mark who spoke, his voice stripped of its performative charm and laced with a cold impatience I had never allowed myself to truly hear before. I heard him ask how much longer they had to put up with this, and then the words that stopped my heart. I heard him say that once he got me into a home, they could finally sell all this junk and liquidate the original company assets. There, in the quiet of the hall, the perfect family picture finally shattered, and I saw with blinding clarity what they truly saw when they looked at me, not a mother or a grandmother, but an obstacle. That night I did not sleep. I sat in Robert's armchair, the one in the hallway where I had heard everything, and I let their words echo in the silence. Old-fashioned. Junk. A home. The cruelty of it was a physical thing, a cold weight in my chest. But as the sun began to cast long gray shadows through the house, the hurt began to change. It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot. It was something else, something I hadn't felt in years. It was clarity. Robert had always said, "Kindness is a choice, Evelyn, not an obligation." For decades I had chosen to be kind. That morning, I chose to be thorough. I went to his office, unlocked the bottom drawer of his old steel filing cabinet, and took out the binder labeled the Robert P. Anderson Family Trust. I spent an hour reading the words I had typed myself 30 years ago, my fingers tracing the signature of our family lawyer, and below it my own. Primary Trustee, a title they had long forgotten I held. At 9 o'clock sharp, I made a single phone call. I can only imagine the scene later that day. Mark, my grandson, likely at some exclusive country club or a dealership for cars that cost more than my first house. I can picture him surrounded by his so-called friends, the kind of people who measure your worth by the logo on your shirt. He would have pulled out his wallet with a flourish, presenting that sleek black credit card tied to the family trust, the one he used like a bottomless well. And I can picture the look on his face when the young man behind the counter swiped it, paused, and informed him that the card had been declined. The embarrassment would have been the first sting. He would have offered another, linked to the same source, only to be met with the same polite refusal. The second sting would have been confusion, quickly curdling into rage. He would have stormed out, pulling out his phone to call his father. His voice not that of a successful tech mogul, but of a spoiled child whose favorite toy had just been taken away. Richard, my son, would have received that call in his pristine office downtown. His initial reaction would have been annoyance at his son, followed by a flustered attempt to fix things. He would have called our private banker a man named Mr. Albright, who has managed our family's affairs for 40 years. I'm sure Richard's voice was full of authority at first, asking about a technical glitch with the accounts, and I can just hear the shift in his tone as Mr. Albright calmly explained that there was no glitch. The primary trust account, the financial heart of our family, had been frozen. All associated credit lines were suspended. Mr. Albright would have explained in his careful, professional way that this action was pending a full and comprehensive audit of all assets and expenditures for the last 10 years. And when Richard, his voice now a squeak of disbelief, asked who could have possibly authorized such a thing, Mr. Albright would have answered with a single devastating name, mine. It wasn't more than an hour later that they arrived at my house. All three of them. They didn't bother to ring the bell. Richard used his key and they stormed into my sunroom, where I was tending to my orchids. They were a flurry of panic and fury. Richard started demanding to know what I had done, telling me I didn't understand how these things worked, that I could disrupt the market value of their holdings. Mark was right behind him, his face red and blotchy, accusing me of trying to embarrass him of being senile and vindictive. Susan tried the soft approach, her voice oozing false concern, suggesting I must be confused, that maybe we should call a doctor. They talked over each other, a frantic chorus of disbelief and accusation, their perfect family facade now completely shattered, revealing the raw desperation underneath. I didn't turn around. I simply continued my work, misting the delicate white petals of a Phalaenopsis orchid Robert had given me on our 50th anniversary. I let their panic wash over me, their words buzzing around my head like frantic gnats. When they finally paused breathless, I set the Meister down on its tray. Without looking at them, I said that my husband's trust was established for one reason: to protect his legacy. And I was simply ensuring it was being protected. The audit, I told them, would continue until I was satisfied. A thick, heavy silence filled the room. Mark started to speak again, but Richard put a hand on his arm, silencing him. They were finally beginning to understand that this was not a mistake. This was a move. Then, and only then, did I turn to face them. I looked at each of them in turn, at Susan's fearful eyes, at Richard's bewildered expression, and finally at Mark's mask of arrogant disbelief. My voice when I spoke was not frail or confused. It was as clear and as steady as it had been the day I signed my name to that trust. I told them that they would be surprised what I understand. They stood there frozen in my quiet sunroom. The anger was gone from their faces, replaced by something new, something I hadn't seen in their eyes in a very long time. It was fear. The fear I had seen in their eyes was a fleeting thing. In its place, something far more insulting began to grow pity. I could see it in the way they started to treat me in the days that followed. They would visit, bringing me soup and blankets, speaking to me in soft, slow tones. They had convinced themselves that my freezing of the trust was not a calculated move, but a symptom, a glitch in an aging mind, a final erratic flash of the woman I used to be before the fog of senility rolled in for good. I knew they were holding their little councils of war when they thought I was napping in my armchair. They were planning their countermove not against a formidable opponent, but against a confused old woman who needed to be managed for her own good. Their fear had been replaced by a smug sense of duty, and that I knew would be their undoing. A week after the incident, they came to me as a united front. Susan did most of the talking, her voice syrupy, with a concern that was as fake as the pearls around her neck. She explained that they were all so worried about me. She said that the stress of managing such a large estate was clearly taking its toll on my health. My son Richard sat beside her, nodding gravely, adding that my recent actions, while understandable, showed that I was overwhelmed. They had already spoken to Mr. Henderson, their family lawyer, who agreed that the best course of action would be for me to grant Richard power of attorney. It would take the burden right off my shoulders, they assured me. It was a gentle, loving ambush. They had a stack of papers all neatly printed, ready for my signature. They saw themselves as saviors rescuing me from myself, while simultaneously seizing the keys to the kingdom. I played my part perfectly. I let my eyes wander around the room as if I was struggling to follow the thread of the conversation. I fiddled with the sleeve of my cardigan. I asked Susan to repeat what she had said, claiming the words were all jumbled in my head. I looked at the legal documents on the coffee table as if they were ancient, inscrutable texts. Finally, I looked from my son's earnest face to my daughter-in-law's patient smile and gave a weak, tired sigh. I told them that it all sounded so very complicated, and that if they thought it was for the best, then it must be. I would, I said, be happy to sign whatever they needed me to. The relief that washed over them was so profound, it was almost comical. They exchanged a look of triumphant pity. They left the papers with me, telling me to look them over and that we could visit the lawyer together next week. They left my house that day feeling smug, relieved, and completely in control. The very next morning, I did not call Mr. Henderson. Instead, I called a taxi. It dropped me off in front of a gleaming glass tower downtown, the kind of building Mark would describe as a vertical campus. My appointment was with a young woman named Jessica Riley. She was nothing like the stuffy, old-world lawyers my family preferred. Her office was minimalist and modern, and she had a mind like a steel trap. I had found her through a women's business group my friend Miriam recommended. They called her a shark, and that was precisely what I needed. I didn't present as a frail, confused old woman to her. I laid out the situation with the clarity of a CEO briefing her board. I explained the trust, the family dynamics, and my ultimate objective. I spoke for 30 minutes without interruption. When I was finished, she just leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. I told her I had one more thing for her, and from my handbag, I produced a small, old-fashioned brass key. I said it was for a safe deposit box at the downtown branch of a bank that hadn't been entered in 35 years. Her smile widened. That evening, the house was quiet again. I retreated to Robert's study, the one I had been organizing. From the very back of a drawer filled with old tax returns and property deeds, I pulled out a small leather-bound book. It was Richard's diary from a lifetime ago. He had given it to me for safekeeping after a fire in his first home, and I suppose he had forgotten all about it. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a memory of the son I once knew. But my eyes fell upon a page dated nearly 40 years ago, the ink smudged in places as if by tears. The entry was short, the handwriting almost illegible in its haste and despair. It read, "Susan told me tonight, after the fight. She told me the child isn't mine. Robert's name, the family business, everything is for nothing. I don't know what to do. The shame would destroy us all." I closed the book, my heart aching not with anger, but with a profound, decades-old sorrow. The secret I had suspected for years was now a certainty, and the man who had called me old-fashioned was not, and had never been, my husband's heir. The day of the meeting with their lawyer, Mr. Henderson, arrived. I let my son drive me sinking into the plush leather of his oversized car. I played the part of the frail, agreeable matriarch to perfection. I wore a simple lavender dress and a string of my plainest pearls. They flanked me as we walked into the lawyer's mahogany-paneled office, their movements a study in condescending care, as if they were guiding a fragile artifact to its final resting place. They were so confident, so sure of their victory. Mr. Henderson, a man I'd known for 40 years, greeted me with a sad, knowing smile, the kind you give to someone whose mind is failing. They all sat on one side of the enormous conference table, a united front of concern. I sat on the other, alone. For a moment, the door opened, and a young woman in a sharply tailored navy suit walked in. She carried a single, slim leather portfolio. It was my lawyer, Ms. Riley. I introduced her calmly and watched as confusion rippled across the faces of my family. Mr. Henderson looked flustered, adjusting his tie. This was not part of their carefully orchestrated plan. Ms. Riley did not sit. She stood beside me, opened her portfolio, and with a voice as crisp and cool as a winter morning, informed everyone in the room that her client, Mrs. Evelyn Anderson, would not be signing any power of attorney documents today. Instead, she was there to inform them that I had that morning filed a petition with the court to completely restructure the Robert P. Anderson Family Trust. The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever experienced. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Richard's face, which had been a mask of paternalistic concern, went slack with disbelief. Mr. Henderson sputtered, turning to me and asking if this was truly my wish, his tone implying I was being manipulated. I simply nodded to Ms. Riley to continue. And continue she did. She laid out the new structure with the detached precision of a surgeon. The bulk of the liquid assets, real estate holdings, and stock portfolios would no longer be held in a simple family trust. They were to be immediately transferred to fund a new entity. Ms. Riley paused for effect before delivering the name. It would be called the Anderson Foundation for Victims of Family Fraud. I watched Susan's face. The color drained from it, leaving behind a pasty gray pallor. She looked as if she'd been struck. But Ms. Riley was not finished. She went on to explain that the foundation's charter was designed to honor my late husband's legacy of integrity and honesty. She said that my primary wish was to ensure that his considerable fortune would only ever benefit his true, direct bloodline. Her gaze swept over my son and grandson, and she spoke a phrase that landed like a physical blow. The new trust makes specific provisions for the unquestionable paternity of all listed heirs. Richard made a small, strangled noise in the back of his throat. He looked at his wife, and in that single shared glance of pure terror, 40 years of lies unraveled between them. They knew. They knew that I knew. Then came the final elegant turn of the knife. Miss Riley slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. It was a press release. The headline announced the formation of the new multi-million-dollar charitable foundation with a lovely professional photograph of me at the top. She explained that the release was scheduled to be sent to every major news outlet and financial journal in the state at 5 o'clock that afternoon. The only thing that would stop its distribution, she said, was their immediate and uncontested agreement to the restructuring. She let the implication hang in the air, a guillotine poised over their reputations, their social standing, their entire world. Fight this, and the questions would begin. Fight this, and the world would start digging. Fight this, and the fraud would become a public spectacle. The aftermath was chaos. For the first time in his life, Mark was speechless. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at his parents, his eyes wide with a confusion that was quickly turning to panic. Richard looked 10 years older than he had, 10 minutes before his hands trembling as he stared at the press release. Their lawyer, Mr. Henderson, was shuffling papers. His professional composure utterly gone his face, a mixture of shock and dawning professional horror. He had been played and he knew it. But it was Susan who finally broke the spell. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled into dust. She began to sob, not loudly but in small, gulping breaths. She looked at me across the table, her eyes filled with a terror so profound it was almost pitiful. I heard her whisper the words to herself, a final admission of defeat in a war she didn't even know she was fighting. "She knows," she choked out. "Oh, God, she knows." They had agreed to the meeting. Of course they had. The threat of public exposure was a far more powerful motivator than any lingering sense of family loyalty. We sat in the same mahogany conference room as before, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. The air was thick with a cloying desperation. My son Richard and his wife Susan sat huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. Their lawyer, Mr. Henderson, looked agitated constantly, shuffling papers and refusing to meet my eye. And Mark. My grandson, or the man I had called my grandson for his entire life, was vibrating with a barely contained rage. He saw this as a negotiation, a final battle he could somehow still win through sheer force of will. He did not yet understand that the war was already over. I remained silent. I had said all I needed to say in the previous meeting. Today, Ms. Riley would do the talking. She began by formally outlining the terms of the trust's dissolution and the charter of the new foundation. She spoke of timelines and asset transfers, her voice a calm, steady drone of legal finality. It was more than Mark could bear. He exploded from his chair, his hands slamming down on the polished table. He launched into a tirade, his voice raw and ugly. He called me a bitter, vindictive old woman. He said I was senile, that I was being manipulated by my new ambulance-chasing lawyer. He accused me of trying to destroy the family out of spite, because I couldn't stand to see him succeed where my husband had only plodded along. He screamed that I was old-fashioned, obsolete, and that he would fight this, that he would prove me incompetent and have me put in a home where I belonged. He paced behind his chair like a caged animal, spitting poison. His parents didn't stop him. They just watched their faces, a mixture of fear and a strange, pathetic hope, as if his rage alone could somehow reverse the tide. I let him exhaust himself, his final desperate act of self-immolation. I listened to the echo of the words I had heard in the hallway, and I felt nothing but a profound, chilling peace. He was making this so much easier. When he finally paused, panting for breath, his face slick with sweat, I did not speak. I simply reached down to the leather bag at my feet and retrieved a simple manila file folder. I placed it on the table in front of me. The sound it made in the silent room was as loud as a gunshot. With a single finger, I slid it across the vast, gleaming expanse of wood. It came to a stop directly in front of Mark. He stared at it, his chest still heaving. Inside that simple manila folder were the results of a paternity test. Ms. Riley, without a word, stood and distributed identical copies to Richard, to Susan, and most importantly, to their shell-shocked lawyer, Mr. Henderson. I watched their faces as they read. I saw the flicker of confusion in Mark's eyes turn to a dawning, gut-wrenching horror. I saw Richard's face crumple, not in anger, but in the final weary acceptance of a lie he had carried for 40 years. And I saw Susan let out a soft, whimpering cry as she covered her face with her hands. Mr. Henderson read the document, his professional mask dissolving into pure, unadulterated shock. He looked at his clients, then at me, as the full scope of the decades-long fraud he had been unknowingly complicit in settled upon him. The room was silent once more, but this was a different silence. This was the silence of annihilation. Ms. Riley's voice cut through the stillness as sharp and clean as a scalpel. She began to explain the legal ramifications, her tone devoid of any emotion. She stated that according to the clear and unambiguous results of the DNA analysis, Mark was not the biological son of Richard Anderson. Therefore, under the precise terms of the original trust established by Robert P. Anderson, he was not and had never been a legal heir. All distributions he had received from the trust over his lifetime, she explained, were received under fraudulent pretenses. The new foundation, as the legal successor to the trust, would be pursuing a full clawback of all funds, estimated to be in the tens of millions of dollars. She then turned her attention to Richard and Susan, explaining that their documented knowledge of this fact and their active concealment of it for financial gain constituted decades of actionable fraud against the trust. She mentioned that while her client had not yet decided to pursue criminal charges, the evidence was more than sufficient to do so. The new will, she concluded, was legally ironclad. The foundation was a fact. Mark's inheritance was gone. His entire identity, built on a mountain of my husband's money, had just evaporated. That was what finally broke them. The cold, hard, inescapable facts. Mark sank into his chair, his face ashen, his eyes vacant. The fight was gone, replaced by a hollowing emptiness. He was a ghost at his own execution. It was my son Richard who spoke first, his voice a ragged whisper. He begged me to stop, to not do this. Susan joined him. Her pleas choked with sobs, promising they would do anything that they were sorry, so sorry. They pleaded for my forgiveness, for my mercy. I looked at the two people who had sat silently while their son called me garbage to be thrown away. I looked at the man my son had become, a man who chose a comfortable lie over a difficult truth. I looked at the woman who had brought this lie into my family and poisoned it from the inside out, and I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a vast, quiet emptiness where my love for them used to be. I rose slowly from my chair. Ms. Riley gathered her papers. I looked at them one last time, these broken, begging people. I told them that the time for pleas was long over. I told them they were strangers to me now, and with that, I turned my back on them and walked out of the room, leaving them alone in the ruins of the lives they had built on deceit. I did not see them again after that day in the conference room. I did not need to. Ms. Riley, my sharp and thorough lawyer, handled everything. She painted a picture for me in her concise, factual reports. I imagined their cavernous house, the one that was always filled with the noise of their self-importance, now cloaked in a deafening silence. The staff had been let go. The caterers and decorators and gardeners had stopped calling. They were alone in a museum of a life they could no longer afford. Ms. Riley told me that a formal notice had been delivered to them via courier. It was a thick envelope containing the initial accounting of the clawback, a staggering multi-generational bill for a life lived on lies. The number was so large it was abstract, a phantom of wealth they had treated as their own. She also mentioned as an aside that one of her clerks had driven past their house to serve a secondary notice and had seen no lights on in the evening. The power company, it seems, does not care about your social standing when the bills go unpaid. Their world had not just been shaken, it had been unplugged. A few weeks later, our local paper ran a feature in its Sunday edition. The headline read, "Reclusive Philanthropist Evelyn Anderson establishes major new foundation." There was a photograph of me taken by a professional Ms. Riley had hired. I was in my garden smiling, looking serene, and I had to admit, powerful. The article spoke in glowing terms of my late husband's integrity and my quiet, lifelong dedication to our community. It detailed the mission of the Anderson Foundation for victims of family fraud, explaining that it would provide legal aid and support for those exploited by the people they should have been able to trust the most. Of my family, it said only that there had been unforeseen changes to the estate's structure, and that my son was pursuing other opportunities. It was a masterclass in polite public execution. Everyone in our town would read between the lines. They would see the truth, not in what was written, but in what was so carefully omitted. My family's fall from grace wasn't announced with a bullhorn. It was cemented in the quiet, respectful prose of my public vindication. My life began to fill with light. The silence in my own home, once a symbol of loneliness, was now a symbol of peace. I visited Robert's grave one bright, clear afternoon. The cemetery was quiet. The air smelled of freshly cut grass. I placed a single, perfect white rose on the cool granite of his headstone. I wasn't there to mourn him. I was there to speak with him. I told him quietly that our house was in order. I told him his legacy was safe now that it would be used to create good in the world, just as he always had. There were no tears, no lingering sadness. There was only a sense of a promise kept, a duty fulfilled. Later that week, I hosted a luncheon for my old bridge club friends I hadn't had the energy to see in years. We sat in my sunroom, the same room where my family had panicked, and the sound of our laughter filled the space. They were the first board members of the new foundation. We didn't just talk about old times. We planned our first project, a workshop, to help elderly people understand and protect their legal and financial rights. I had a purpose again, one that was truly my own. One final piece of the past arrived in the mail about a month after the meeting. It was a handwritten letter on expensive pale blue stationery. I recognized Susan's elegant looping script immediately. I opened it without any particular feeling. It was 10 pages long. 10 pages of rambling excuses, of rewriting history, of blaming her own unhappiness, of pleading for me to understand her choices. It was a desperate, self-serving appeal to a connection she herself had severed. There were pleas for forgiveness, but no true accountability. It was all about how she felt, what she had been through, and how I could ease her pain by letting them back into my life, back into my fortune. I read every word, my face impassive. It was like reading a story about people I used to know a long, long time ago. When I finished, I folded the pages, neatly slid them back into the envelope, and walked to the small office I had set up for my foundation work. I did not keep the letter. I did not burn it in some dramatic fit of anger. I simply fed it into the new paper shredder I had bought, and with a quiet mechanical whir, I turned her final desperate plea into a basket full of meaningless confetti. She learned that old-fashioned is what people call the things they no longer have the character to uphold truth, loyalty, and respect. Her family had thought her silence was weakness, but it was simply patience. They believed her kindness was frailty, but it was a choice she was free to unmake. In the end, she did not seek revenge. She sought the truth, and the truth is its own form of justice. She showed them in the world what a real legacy looks like when it is protected by a quiet, unbreakable will.